The morning Bessie Cooper pressed the barrel of her Winchester rifle against Isaac Garrison's chest was the same morning the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the first real snow of 1883 began to fall over the Wyoming territory. She had found him on her land. That was the simple, infuriating truth of it. He was crouched beside the frozen creek that ran along the eastern edge of her property, breaking ice with the heel of his boot, watering a horse that was not his, because the horse, the big roan mare with the white blaze, belonged to Bessie, and had belonged to her late husband before her, and she had tracked the animal through 3 miles of pine forest with snowflakes catching in her dark hair and fury burning in her chest like a coal stove at full blast. "Step away from my horse," she said. Isaac Garrison straightened slowly. He was tall, broader through the shoulder than she had expected from the tracks he had left in the mud 2 days ago when she had first noticed the mare was gone. He wore a canvas coat that had seen better years and a hat pulled low against the rising wind, and when he turned to look at her, she saw that his jaw was set in the particular way of a man who believed he had a reasonable explanation for an unreasonable situation. "Ma'am," he said, "I can explain." "You can explain to the sheriff in Laramie," Bessie said. "Start walking." "The sheriff in Laramie is 60 miles south and there is a blizzard coming," Isaac said. He glanced up at the sky with an expression of genuine concern, as if the blizzard were a mutual problem they might solve together, rather than an obstacle she had created for him, by catching him red-handed beside her stolen horse. "Did not steal your mare. She broke through the fence on the north pasture. I saw her wandering on the ridge above my claim, and I brought her down so she would not freeze. I was bringing her back to you." "You were bringing her back to me," Bessie repeated, her voice flat. "Yes, ma'am. In the opposite direction of my homestead." There was a pause. Isaac looked down at the creek, then back at her. "The creek path is easier on a horse with a loose shoe." Bessie looked at the mare's left foreleg. The shoe was indeed loose. She had not noticed that before, and the fact that he was right about it made her more angry, not less. "That does not explain why you were on my land 2 days ago." "I found your boot prints near the barn." Something shifted in his expression then, something complicated that she did not have the patience to interpret with a rifle in her hands and snow beginning to pile on the brim of her hat. "I was looking for something," he said. "Not stealing, looking." "For what?" He met her eyes. His were brown, dark as creek water after a rain, and there was something steady in them that she recognized and distrusted. It was the steadiness of a man who had learned to look calm because showing otherwise had cost him too much in the past. "I believe your husband hid something on this property before he died," Isaac said. "Something that belonged to my family first." The world went very quiet around Bessie Cooper. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a held breath, of a moment balanced on a knife's edge before it fell one way or another. Her husband, Frank Cooper, had been dead for 8 months. He had been a complicated man, and she had loved him, and she had also spent the 8 months since his death finding out that she had not known him nearly as well as she believed. "What," she said carefully, "did my husband take from your family?" "Land deed," Isaac said. "For the 40 acres on the South Fork. My father signed it over to Frank Cooper in a card game 7 years ago." "Except my father did not play cards, never in his life, and he died 6 months before that game supposedly happened. So either Frank Cooper forged the deed or he bought it forged, and either way, that land does not legally belong to your estate." Bessie lowered the rifle by 3 inches. Not because she trusted him, but because the snow was falling harder now, and the sky above the pines had gone the color of iron, and because Isaac Garrison had just handed her one more truth about Frank Cooper that she had not wanted but could not deny. There had been other truths like that. The outstanding debt in Cheyenne. The woman in the territorial records listed as a previous wife. The money that should have been in the strongbox and was not. "Come to the cabin," she said finally. "We will talk about this inside." She expected him to look triumphant. He did not. He looked, she thought, relieved in a way that was almost painful to witness, as if talking to her like a human being instead of looking down the barrel of a rifle was a luxury he had not anticipated being offered. They walked the mare back along the creek path because the shoe was loose and Isaac was right about the terrain. They did not speak. The snow came down in thick curtains now, and the wind pushed it sideways through the pines, and by the time the cabin came into view through the white haze, the tracks they had made coming in were already filled in behind them. Bessie's cabin was not large, but it was solid. Frank had built it well, whatever else he had done or failed to do, and she had chinked the logs herself last autumn and stacked enough firewood along the south wall to last until March. She led the mare into the small lean-to stable at the back and made sure the animal had feed and water and a blanket over her withers, and when she came inside, Isaac Garrison was standing in the middle of her main room with his hat in his hands and snow melting off his coat onto her swept floor. She put the rifle back on its pegs beside the door. It was a gesture, not a surrender. She could reach it in 4 steps, and they both knew it. "Sit," she said, and moved to the stove to stoke the fire. He sat at the table, and she could feel him watching her while she worked, the way people watch someone do a familiar task when they themselves have not had the comfort of familiarity in a long time. She put coffee on. She put beans and salt pork on to heat. Outside, the wind was beginning to moan at the eaves the way it did when a real storm meant business. "That storm is going to be bad," Isaac said. "I know it. Is there somewhere you need to be? Family who will worry?" Bessie set 2 tin cups on the table and sat across from him. "There is no one who will worry," she said. "There has not been anyone to worry for 8 months." She said it plainly, not for sympathy, just as a fact, the same way she would have stated that there were 12 jars of pickled beets on the cellar shelf. "Now, tell me about this land deed." He told her everything. Took a long time, and the coffee went cold, and she got up to refill it, and he kept talking, and she listened the way she had learned to listen in the years before Frank Cooper, when listening carefully was sometimes the only advantage a woman had. Isaac's father, William Garrison, had homesteaded the 40 acres on the South Fork in 1871. He had built a house there, run cattle there, buried his wife there in 1874. He had died of a fever in the spring of 1876. Isaac had been 19 years old and working as a ranch hand in Colorado when he got the news, and when he came back to Wyoming, he found that the land had been transferred by deed to a man named Frank Cooper, with documentation suggesting his father had sold it in a card game in April of 1876, a month when, Isaac was certain, his father was already dead. "You cannot be certain of the month," Bessie said, not accusing, just examining. "I have a letter," Isaac said. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded envelope, worn soft at the creases from years of handling. He spread it on the table. The handwriting was shaky, a sick man's hand, but the date was clear, March 14, 1876. The letter was from William Garrison to Isaac, written while William was ill, telling his son to come home. The card game deed was dated April 3rd. Bessie looked at the letter for a long time, then she looked up at Isaac. "If this letter is real, then my husband stole your land." "Yes," Isaac said. He said it quietly. He was not gloating. There was no satisfaction in his voice, only the exhausted weight of a truth carried for too long. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm announced itself fully, throwing itself against the cabin walls with a sound like a large and furious animal. The fire popped, and the lantern light wavered and settled. "My husband stole a lot of things," Bessie said at last. "I have been learning that over the past 8 months. I have been learning it the hard way, one piece at a time." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I will help you find the deed. If it is in this cabin or on this property, I will help you find it. And if we find it, I will not contest your claim to the South Fork." Isaac Garrison looked at her across the table with an expression that was harder to read than anything she had seen from a person in years. "Why," he said, "you owe me nothing." "I owe you nothing," she agreed. "But I owe myself the chance to do something right with this land that was built on wrongs. And I owe your father's memory that much, at least." She stood and took her cup to the window and looked out at the white erasure of the storm. "You will not make it back to your claim tonight. In this storm you would not make half a mile before you were lost. You can stay here." The silence that followed was long enough that she turned to look at him. "Ma'am," Isaac said, "I would not want to impose." "You are imposing either way," Bessie said. "This is the only shelter for miles in any direction, and letting you walk out into that blizzard would be murder, regardless of how this morning started." She set her cup down. "There is a cot in the storage room. The door latches from both sides. I trust you understand that I am not offering anything other than shelter." "I understand," he said, and again there was that steadiness in him, that carefully maintained calm. "And I am grateful, Miss Cooper." "Mrs. Cooper," she corrected, not because she felt like a wife anymore, but because the correction was automatic after 3 years. "Mrs. Cooper," he said, "I am grateful." She showed him the storage room with its cot and its extra blanket and the latch on the door. She banked the main fire for the night and blew out the lantern and lay in her own bed, listening to the storm shake the world outside, and wondering what exactly she had let into her house, and whether the steadiness in Isaac Garrison's eyes was the kind that came from being a good man or the kind that came from being a patient one. In the morning the storm was still running. She woke to find him already up, the fire rebuilt and the coffee on, and he had found the mending basket and was sitting at the table stitching the split shoulder seam of one of his shirts, something she had not expected a man of the frontier to do for himself. He did it competently in small even stitches, not beautifully but functionally, and when he looked up and saw her in the doorway, he said, "Good morning," the way a person says it when they mean it rather than when it is a social obligation. "Good morning," she said, and went to look at the sky through the window. "Still coming down." "Still coming down," he agreed. They ate breakfast together with the careful politeness of strangers sharing a table at a boarding house, both of them aware of the strangeness of the situation, and both of them, Bessie thought, deciding simultaneously and silently to simply be practical about it. The storm would last as long as it lasted. Until it stopped, they were stuck with each other. Fighting about it would make the walls close in faster. "I want to look through Frank's papers today," Bessie said. "The deed you are looking for, if it is here, will be in the strongbox or in the trunk in the back room. I have been meaning to go through it all properly since summer, but I have been putting it off." She paused. "I would like you present when I search. I would prefer there to be a witness." Isaac looked up from his coffee. "Why a witness?" "Because if I find what you are looking for, I want it to be beyond question that I found it in the presence of the man who has been searching for it. I do not want any question later about whether I altered it or disposed of it." She met his eyes. "My husband's reputation is already compromised. Mine does not need to follow." He nodded slowly. "That is reasonable." They spent the morning at the table with the strongbox open between them and Frank Cooper's private papers spread in a wide arc across the wood. There were debts and more debts, letters from creditors in 3 different cities, a bill of sale for cattle that did not match the number recorded in the ranch ledger, and a bundle of letters tied with twine that Bessie set aside without looking at, because the handwriting on the top envelope was not hers and she was not ready for that particular truth today. There was no land deed for the South Fork. "It might be in the trunk," Isaac said. He was careful with the papers, she had noticed. He handled them as if aware that they were her grief, not just documents, as if he understood that each page was another layer of a marriage being unburied, and the woman across the table was doing the unburying in front of a stranger. The trunk was in the back room, and it was heavy with the accumulated weight of Frank Cooper's history. She had opened it once, briefly, in the weeks after his death, and had closed it again because the looking had been too much. Now she opened it properly, methodically, with Isaac sitting on the edge of the cot, and the lantern turned up full against the gray light coming through the small window. Old letters. A Bible with names written on the inside cover, a family tree that did not include Bessie, a folded newspaper from 1869 announcing the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, a tintype photograph of a woman Bessie had never seen, young and laughing, with a name written on the back in Frank's hand that she did not recognize, and at the bottom, underneath, a wool blanket and wrapped in oilskin, a thin stack of documents. Bessie unwrapped them with hands that were steadier than she felt. She went through them one by one. A certificate of ownership for a mining claim that had never produced anything. A letter from a lawyer in Cheyenne that she set aside to read later. And there, the third document from the bottom, a land deed for 40 acres on the South Fork of the Laramie River, dated April 3, 1876, signed in the name of William Garrison, with a notary stamp from a county office that, when she looked at it closely, she could see had been applied imperfectly. The ink slightly smeared in a way that suggested the stamp had been used on a document that had already been filled in rather than stamped first and filled in after. She looked at it for a long moment, then she held it out to Isaac. He took it from her with both hands, the way you take something fragile or something sacred, and he looked at it for a long time, and the expression on his face moved through something she could not put a name to and came out the other side as a kind of quiet, bare relief that was almost hard to watch. "This is it," he said. His voice was rough. "It is yours," Bessie said. "It was always yours." He looked up at her. There was a brightness in his eyes that he blinked back immediately, and she pretended not to notice, because allowing a man his dignity was the least she could offer in exchange for the fact that she had pointed a rifle at his chest yesterday morning. "I have been looking for this for 7 years, he said. "I know," she said, even though she had only known for 1 day. She said it because it was the right thing to say, the true thing, the thing that acknowledged the weight of 7 years of searching and the $32 horse he had saved from wandering in the cold, and the letter from his dying father worn soft at the creases from years in his coat pocket. "Thank you," Isaac said. "Do not thank me for returning something that should have been yours to begin with," Bessie said, and went back to the main room to put another log on the fire, because the alternative was to sit in that small back room with the lamp turned up and watch Isaac Garrison hold his father's land deed, and she did not trust herself to remain composed through that. The storm ran for 3 full days. In those 3 days, Bessie Cooper learned more about Isaac Garrison than she had known about most people after years of acquaintance. She learned that he had been born in Ohio in 1855 and had come west with his parents at age 8, and that he remembered the journey as an adventure, and only understood later that his parents had been desperate enough to call desperation an adventure. She learned that he could cook, not in the elaborate way of a trained cook, but in the competent way of a man who had fed himself from a campfire for years, and had learned which shortcuts made food worse and which made it better. He made a pot of stew on the second night that was genuinely better than anything Bessie had produced from the same ingredients, and she told him so, and he looked pleased in a way that he immediately tried to hide behind a modest shrug. She learned that he had spent the years since his father's death working his way back to Wyoming, doing ranch work and some freighting, and 1 winter of logging that had left a scar on the inside of his left forearm that he was not particularly forthcoming about. She learned that he had a sense of humor that came out sideways, disguised as straightforward observation, so that it sometimes took her a beat to realize he had made a joke, and that when she did realize it and laughed, something in him relaxed, the way a room relaxes when you open a window in summer. She also learned that he watched her the way she watched him, carefully and with more attention than either of them advertised. She would catch him looking when she was reading, or when she was braiding her hair before bed, or when she stood at the window in the morning with her coffee and let herself grieve the marriage she had thought she had, and each time she caught him, he looked away without embarrassment, as if looking were something he had decided to be honest about even if he was not yet sure what it meant. On the second evening, with the storm howling its full complaint at the corners of the cabin, she told him about the woman in the letters she had set aside. She did not plan to tell him. It came out while they were sitting on opposite sides of the fire, each reading. He had found a survey map in Frank's papers that he was studying, and she had been reading the letter from the lawyer in Cheyenne, and the letter had said certain things about Frank Cooper's obligations that she had no one to tell, and the telling had become a pressure she could not hold any more. "He had another wife," she said, "before me. She is listed in the territorial records. He never told me. The letters are from her, I think. I have not read them, but the lawyer's letter references her as a previous spouse still living. So he was a bigamist. She said the last word with the flat, careful precision of someone who has said a difficult word for the first time out loud and found that it does not destroy them. He has been dead for 8 months and he is still surprising me. Isaac set the survey map down. He did not say he was sorry, which she appreciated, because she had heard enough sorrow from enough people and it did not do anything useful. "What will you do?" he asked. "About the land, I can only hold what he legally acquired," she said. "About the woman in the letters, I do not know yet. She may not know he is dead." She turned the lawyer's letter over in her hands. "She may deserve to know." "She does deserve to know," Isaac said quietly. "Whatever else happened, she deserves to know." Bessie looked at him. "You have a particular feeling about that." "My mother waited 4 years for a man who had left and married someone else," Isaac said. "She did not know until a letter came from his second wife's brother. It nearly broke her, but she always said that at least she knew. Knowing was better than waiting." He paused. "I do not know if your situation is the same, but I think most people would rather have the truth, even when the truth is terrible." "Yes," Bessie said. "I think so too." They were quiet for a while after that, comfortable in the way that people become comfortable when they have shared something that matters. Outside, the storm kept on, and the fire burned low and they fed it together. And at some point, Bessie fell asleep in her chair and woke to find that Isaac had put the extra blanket over her without disturbing her, and had himself fallen asleep with his back against the wall and the survey map still in his lap. She looked at him for a moment in the firelight. This man who had been her enemy 4 days ago and had become, by the pressure of a blizzard and the weight of shared truths, something she did not have a word for yet. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and let herself fall back to sleep. On the 3rd morning, the storm stopped. The silence it left behind was extraordinary, the specific silence of a world that has been remade overnight, every sound absorbed into feet of fresh snow, the pines bent under white weight, the sky above them a scrubbed and brilliant blue. Bessie stood in the doorway and breathed it in, the cold, clean air that came after a blizzard, that particular smell of renewal and erasure. Isaac came to stand behind her, not close, just near enough that she was aware of him, and they both looked out at the transformed world in silence. "I should go," he said. "Yes," she said. "The South Fork is a good 2 hours on horseback in this snow," he said. "Longer if the drifts are deep." "They will be deep," she said. "I know it." Neither of them moved. "The roof of the stable needs rechinching before the next snow," Bessie said. "The far corner, I noticed it yesterday. A man came out in the fall to do it, but he missed that corner." "I could look at it," Isaac said, "before I go." "I would appreciate that," Bessie said. He spent an hour on the stable roof, and she fed the mare, and the 2 chickens she kept in a corner of the stable for warmth. And when he came down, his hands were cold, and she made coffee and gave him a pair of Frank's old work gloves because the ones Isaac had were cracked through and letting the cold in. He accepted the gloves without making it into a moment, and she was grateful for that. "The deed," she said, when they were back in the cabin drinking the coffee. "You should have it witnessed, filed properly. There are people in Laramie who can challenge it even with the original in hand." "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about that." "Harold Pruitt is the land agent in Laramie," she said. "He is honest, which is not something you can say about everyone in that office. If you tell him what you have told me with the letter and the deed, and he can compare the notary stamp with the county records, he should be able to confirm the forgery." She paused. "I would go with you, as a witness. I found it, and Frank was my husband, and my testimony would carry weight." Isaac looked at her with that steady, complicated expression. "You would do that?" "Yes, why?" "Because I already told you why," she said. "Because it is simply the right thing to do, and I have spent 8 months living with the consequences of a man who did not do the right thing, and I find that I am tired of those consequences." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "The South Fork is your land. It was your father's. I would like it to be legally, officially, publicly yours before another winter passes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Cooper, I owe you more than I can repay." "You do not owe me anything," she said. "But you could," she added, and surprised herself because she had not planned to say what came next. "Come back, if you wanted to. Once the weather is clear enough to travel, we could go to Laramie together and see Harold Prout. And in the meantime, if the South Fork is in as poor shape as I have heard, you may need a place to work from while you get it back in order. The storage room is small, but it is better than a drafty claim shack in January." She kept her eyes on her coffee while she said it, and she was not entirely sure why she had said it at all, except that 3 days of blizzard had given her a clearer view of her own loneliness than she had allowed herself to have before, and the cabin felt already emptier with Isaac Garrison only halfway out the door. He did not answer immediately, and she did not press him, and when she looked up he was watching her with an expression that had the weight of a decision being made carefully. "The South Fork claim shack has a hole in the west wall that I have been patching with oilskin for 2 months, he said at last. "It does not patch well." "I imagine it does not," Bessie said. "I would not want to be a burden." "You would not be a burden if you were useful," she said. "And you are useful. You make better stew than I do, and you rechinked the stable corner in an hour in knee-deep snow." There was a pause, and then Isaac Garrison smiled, a real smile, the first full one she had seen from him, and it altered his face entirely, made him look younger and less carefully defended, and Bessie felt something shift inside her chest like the first small movement of ice in a creek before the thaw. She recognized it and immediately found something else to look at. He stayed. He went back to the South Fork twice in the first 2 weeks, each time to check on the claim and bring back supplies he had stored there, and each time he came back to the cabin and settled back into the spare rhythm they had established without either of them discussing it. He did the outdoor heavy work in the mornings, tending the animals, chopping wood, keeping the path to the barn clear, and she managed the indoor work and the cooking, and in the evenings they sat by the fire and talked or read, and the talking came easier each day, like a road improving with use. She told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, the daughter of a schoolteacher, which was where the steadiness in her came from. Her father had believed that a calm mind was the most useful tool a person could carry. She told him about Frank Cooper sweeping into her father's town on a horse that cost more than her father earned in a year, charming and confident and full of stories about the wide-open West, and how she had been 23 years old and hungry for the wide-open world and had believed every word. She told him this without self-pity and without anger, just as the story of how she had gotten here, and he listened the same way she listened to his stories, with complete attention and without judgment. He told her about the 7 years of searching for the deed, how he had spent seasons working his way close to Frank Cooper's orbit without ever quite closing in, how he had twice nearly given up and gone back to Colorado, and how each time he had thought about his father's grave on the South Fork, unmarked because he had not been able to afford a stone and the wood marker had rotted away, and he had kept going. He told her this evenly, and she heard under the evenness everything that 7 years of a quiet, determined grief sounds like, and she did not try to find words for it, because some things are beyond the reach of words, and what they deserve instead is simply to be witnessed. They went to Laramie in January, when the weather broke for a week and gave them a window of passable road. They went on horseback because the wagon track was still drifted in places. Bessie rode the roan mare and Isaac rode his own horse, a gray gelding with a hard-working look about him, and they rode side by side through a landscape so white and clean it was like riding through an illustration in a book. Harold Prout was a small, precise man with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the careful manner of someone who has seen enough dishonesty in his profession to have developed a deep personal appreciation for the honest transaction. He examined the deed, examined the letter, compared the notary stamp with the county records, and took off his spectacles and polished them and put them back on in the way of a man who needs a moment to compose himself before speaking. "This stamp," he said, "is indeed from our office, but the record number on it does not correspond to a legitimate filing for this date. The number belongs to a filing made in 1874. Someone used an impression of the stamp on a later document. He looked at Bessie. "You found this in your late husband's effects, Mrs. Cooper." "In a trunk, yes," she said, "in the presence of Mr. Garrison. I have a written account of the circumstances of the finding, signed by both of us, if that is useful." Harold Prout looked at the signed account they had prepared the night before leaving, sitting at the table after supper with Bessie writing in her careful schoolteacher's daughter hand, and Isaac reading it over and signing his name at the bottom. "This is very useful," Harold Prout said. He looked at Isaac. "Mr. Garrison, this will take some processing, perhaps 2 to 3 weeks, but I am confident that the original deed in your father's name supersedes this forged transfer. The 40 acres on the South Fork will be recorded in your name." Isaac stood very still. "I appreciate that," he said, in a voice that was quieter than usual. Bessie signed the witness statement and they stepped out into the cold Laramie Street, and for a moment they both just stood there in the thin January sunlight with the busy town moving around them. And then Isaac looked at her and said simply, "Thank you, Bessie." It was the first time he had used her given name. She had been Mrs. Cooper for weeks, careful and proper, and now she was Bessie, and the sound of it in his voice was different from how anyone else had ever said it, and she told herself it was the cold making her face warm. "You are welcome, Isaac," she said, and meant it as something far larger than 2 words. They had lunch at the hotel dining room, which was the first time Bessie had eaten a meal she had not cooked herself in 8 months, and it was mediocre food, but the luxury of sitting at a table and being served, it was something she had not realized she had missed. They talked about what needed doing on the South Fork in the spring, and about the cattle situation, because Isaac had plans to run a small herd and Bessie had a contact at a ranch south of town who might have stock to sell at a fair price. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, they stopped being 2 people with a transaction between them, and became 2 people planning a future that assumed the other person would be present for it. Bessie noticed this somewhere around the 3rd cup of coffee, and did not know what to do with the noticing. So she paid her half of the lunch bill in the methodical way of a woman who is managing her own affairs, and they rode back toward the homestead in the cold January afternoon. They were 2 miles from the cabin when Isaac's horse turned an ankle in a hidden rut under the snow and threw him. He landed hard but rolled with it, military clean, and was on his feet before Bessie had fully stopped the mare. But when he put weight on his left foot, he stopped and made a face that said everything about his ankle without requiring words. "Get back on the horse," she said. "I am fine." "You are not fine. Get back on the horse and I will lead the gray." He got back on the horse because the alternative was arguing with Bessie Cooper about it, and he seemed to have already understood that arguing with Bessie Cooper about practical matters was not a productive use of anyone's energy. She took the gray's reins and led both horses the rest of the way to the cabin, and he limped inside and sat in the chair by the fire and let her look at the ankle without protest, which cost him something, she could tell, because he was not a man accustomed to being tended to. It was a sprain, not a break. She had enough experience with ranch injuries to know the difference. She wrapped it with strips of cloth and told him to keep it elevated, and he said he would, and she said she knew he would not, and he did not. And the next morning she found him in the stable doing the morning feed on 1 foot, and the look on his face when she appeared in the doorway was the look of a man who has been caught doing exactly what he was told not to do, and has no defense against a woman who predicted he would do it. "Go back inside," she said. "The animals need—" "I am standing in the stable," Bessie said. "The animals will be fed. Go back inside." He went back inside. She fed the animals and let herself smile about it where he could not see her, and when she came back in he had made the coffee and was sitting at the table with the survey map of the South Fork that he had been studying for weeks, planning the spring work. "You are stubborn," he said, by way of greeting. "Yes," she said. "I appreciate it," he said, which was not what she expected, and she looked at him, and he was looking at the survey map, but there was a smile at the corner of his mouth, real and quiet and for her. "I appreciate that you appreciate it," she said, and poured her coffee. February came in on a wind from the north that froze everything it touched. Inside the cabin, with the fire at full burn and the two of them occupying the space that had always been just hers, Bessie found that the months had made her accustomed to a way of life that surprised her. Not the life she had imagined in Pennsylvania at 23, dreaming of adventure. Something more complicated and more honest. Supper conversations that went wherever the evening went. A man who read the same books she read and had different opinions about them and was willing to say so. The sound of someone else breathing in the dark cabin. Not loneliness, but its opposite. Not the absence of loneliness that Frank had provided with his constant boisterous noise, but the actual presence of another person she could trust. She was looking at Isaac Garrison one evening in February. He was reading by the fire, the lamplight on the side of his face, his long fingers holding the book, and she thought with startling clarity, very simply as if stating a plain fact, "I think I love this man." She put down her own book and went to stand at the window and look at the snow-covered dark outside, because the thought was too large to be in the same space with the thing it was about. The thing about loving Isaac Garrison was that it was not the love she had felt for Frank Cooper, which had been a kind of brightness, urgent and a little blind, the love of a young woman for a man who promised her the world. This was slower. This was built from known things. The way he treated the mare with consideration, the way he had held his father's land deed, the way he had never once in all these weeks taken more than he was offered, never pushed against the careful boundaries of the space she had given him, never made her feel like the hospitality she had extended was a debt she owed him. It was built from his steadiness and his quiet humor and his absolute honesty, and the way the cabin felt, she realized, like home in a way it never quite had when Frank was alive. She stood at the window until she had the love firmly arranged inside her, like something packed carefully for travel, and then she turned back to the room. "Isaac," she said. He looked up from the book. She sat back down in her chair and picked up her book. She was not ready to say the thing. She knew she would have to say it eventually, because silence between them had become the kind of silence that is also a communication, and she could feel the air in the cabin changing around whatever this was between them, the way weather changes before a storm. But tonight was not the night. Tonight she would sit here in the firelight and know it privately, and that would be enough. "Nothing," she said. "I only wanted to know if you wanted more coffee." "I do," he said and smiled, and she got up to pour it. There was a night in late February when the temperatures dropped so far below zero that the water in the wash basin beside the door froze solid between dusk and full dark. She had gone to bed early and woken at some point in the deep night to find the cabin colder than it should have been, and when she got up to check the stove, she found it was running low on fuel. She built it back up with the logs from the bin beside it, but the bin was running low too, and when she looked at the window, the snow was coming down again with a quiet seriousness that suggested it meant to come down for a while. She went to knock on the storage room door. "Isaac." There was a pause and then the sound of someone coming awake. "Yes. The fire was low. I have built it back up, but the wood bin is running thin and there is snow coming down. I thought you should know." There was the sound of him getting up, and then the door opened, and he stood there in the dark in his trousers and undershirt, hair unsettled from sleep, and she was suddenly and thoroughly aware of the smallness of the cabin and the late hour, and the fact that they had been living in close proximity for 3 months, and the love she had arranged carefully in herself 2 weeks ago was significantly less neat than she had made it. "I will get more wood," he said. "You do not need to go out in this." "I am not sending you out in this," he said, in a tone that admitted no argument, and reached past her for his coat and boots. She stood in the main room while he went out, and she listened to him working at the wood pile and felt the cold rush in each time he opened the door and built the fire properly while she waited. And when he came back in the last time, red-cheeked from the cold and with snow in his hair, she handed him a cup of hot coffee and said, "Thank you," and he said, "Of course," and they stood in the small circle of firelight in the deep winter night and looked at each other. "Bessie," he said and stopped. "Yes," she said. "I need to say something," he said, "and I want to say it correctly." "Say it any way it comes," she said, because she knew what was coming and she found that she did not want it to be careful. She wanted it to be real. "I came here in November to recover a document from a woman I expected to be my enemy," Isaac said. He set the coffee cup down on the table, deliberate, as if clearing space for the thing he was about to say. "And I found someone who handed me my father's land back without hesitation, who rode 60 miles in January to stand in a land office and tell the truth on my behalf, who wrapped my ankle and fed my horse and talked with me through a winter I would otherwise have spent alone. And I find myself," he paused, "I find myself in a situation that I did not anticipate and do not know what to do with, except that I am very clear about what it is." "What is it?" Bessie asked very quietly. "I am in love with you," Isaac said. "I have been for some time. I do not know exactly when it happened. I suspect it happened in pieces, each piece too small to notice until they were all there at once and I could not pretend otherwise." He held her gaze with that steady brown-eyed look that she had distrusted 4 months ago and now trusted more than almost anything. "I am not asking anything of you. I know it is complicated. I know you are still making peace with what Frank left you with. I know I am not the person you expected to find on your doorstep, but I could not let another day pass without you knowing." The fire popped behind her. Outside, the snow came down in the dark. "Isaac Garrison," Bessie Cooper said, "I have been in love with you since at least the second week of December, and I have been managing it quietly ever since because I did not know if you felt the same, and I was not ready to be wrong about one more person." She held his gaze. "I am glad to know I was not wrong." He crossed the room in 3 steps and she was standing straight and open-faced when he reached her, not surprised, not stepping back. And when he put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her, it was the kind of kiss that is the result of months of built-up knowing, careful and certain, and completely without pretense. She put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat, fast and steady both at once, and kissed him back with everything she had been packing carefully for weeks. They stood there in the firelight for a long time after the first kiss, foreheads together, her hands on his chest and his on her face, both of them breathing the same warm air. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the fire was fully and properly burning and the cabin was the warmest it had been all winter. "I should go back to the storage room," Isaac said, not with urgency, just with the care of a man who respects the difference between what is right and what is wanted. "You should," Bessie agreed. "Good night, Bessie." "Good night, Isaac." He went back to the storage room and she heard the latch click softly. She sat by the fire for another hour, not thinking in words, just feeling the warmth of everything that had just been said and decided. And when she finally went to bed, she slept the deep, easy sleep of a person who has put down a weight they have been carrying so long they had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. March came slowly and then all at once, the way it does in Wyoming, where winter fights every inch of the retreat and then one day simply stops, and the melt begins, and the world smells like mud and pine sap and the impossible green of new grass under the last snow. The creek that had been frozen solid all winter broke up on a Monday, the ice going with a series of cracks like rifle shots that carried across the whole valley, and Bessie heard it from the barn and stopped what she was doing and stood still to listen. She found Isaac on the porch when she came back around, leaning on the railing and watching the water running where there had been ice, the first real running water in months, and he looked at her when she came up beside him with an expression that was still that particular steadiness she had come to know so well, but warmer now, the way a fire looks different when you know who built it. "Thaw," he said. "Thaw," she agreed. He reached out and took her hand, not with fanfare, just the natural meeting of 2 hands in the same place at the same time, and she wrapped her fingers around his and they stood together watching the creek run free and the season turn. "I need to talk to you about something," Isaac said. She looked at him. "I have been thinking," he said, about what happens next. The South Fork deed will be recorded in my name. I have the land. I have some money put by, enough to start building properly in the spring. He paused and chose his words. I could go build a proper house on the South Fork, start over there, or, she said. Or I could have a different kind of conversation with you first, he said. About what you would want, about what might make sense for both of us, about whether a man who started the winter as your enemy might be worth considering as something else before the spring is out. Bessie looked at him for a long moment, at the Wyoming sky opening up above them, blue and enormous, at the pines still heavy with snow but starting to drip, at the man beside her who had come to her door with nothing but a 7-year-old letter and his father's stolen land, and had given her, somewhere in the middle of the worst winter she had known, the thing she had been missing for much longer than 8 months. I have been thinking about that too, she said. And, he said, and there was nothing casual in the way he said it. The South Fork and this homestead together make a stronger claim than either alone, she said. The creek boundary between them is a natural fence line. The combined acreage is enough to run cattle properly. The cabin here is solid and the South Fork has better summer pasture. She was looking straight out at the thawing creek while she said all of this, very practical, very measured, and then she turned and looked at him directly. And I would rather not spend another winter alone, and I would rather not spend it with anyone other than you. Isaac Garrison looked at her with his steady brown eyes, and the warmth in them was something she felt as a physical thing, real and unhurried and certain. Then I think I should go to Laramie, he said, and acquire a proper ring and have a conversation with whatever passes for a preacher in this county. There is a circuit preacher, Bessie said, comes through on the first Sunday of the month. Next visit would be April. April, Isaac said and smiled. I can wait until April if you can. I have waited this long, Bessie said. He pulled her close and she let herself rest against him for a moment, her cheek against his shoulder, his arms solid and warm around her. And behind them the cabin that had held them through a Wyoming winter stood steady and chinked tight against the changing air. And ahead of them the creek ran free, and the grass was starting to show green at the edges of the snow, and the whole season was turning like a great patient wheel toward something new. April came. The circuit preacher was a wide man named Brother Caldwell, who wore his collar slightly crooked, and had the practical theology of someone who had married and buried more frontier people than he could count, and had long since stopped expecting any of it to look like it did in the East. He arrived on the first Sunday of April with mud on his boots and a Bible in his saddlebag, and he performed the ceremony in the main room of Bessie's cabin with Isaac standing straight and clear-eyed and Bessie in the blue dress that was the best thing she owned, with wildflowers she had found at the edge of the melting snow in the meadow below the barn, tiny yellow things just pushing up through the last brown grass. There were no other guests. They had discussed it and agreed that a quiet ceremony was what they wanted, that the celebration was between them and did not require an audience to be real. The only witness was a neighbor woman named Ruth Carver from the next valley, who had brought them a jar of preserves when she heard about the wedding, and stayed to watch and cried with the unself-conscious emotion of a woman who has seen enough hardship to cry freely at the sight of two people choosing happiness. Brother Caldwell asked them the questions and they gave the answers, and when Isaac said "I do," his voice was the steadiest thing in the room, and when Bessie said "I do," she meant every word with the full weight of a woman who has learned the difference between a promise made in blindness and a promise made in complete and clear-eyed knowledge of the person she is making it to. The ring was gold, plain, bought from a jeweler in Laramie, and it fit as if it had been made for her, which Isaac said was luck, and Bessie said luck had nothing to do with it. She had told him exactly which of her fingers and which size when he went, and he laughed and said that was why she was the practical one. After Brother Caldwell left and Ruth Carver went home with her empty jar and her happy tears, Isaac and Bessie stood alone in the cabin that was now jointly theirs in every meaning of the word. "Mr. and Mrs. Garrison," Isaac said, testing the sound of it. "I was Mrs. Cooper for 3 years," Bessie said. "I think I will like Mrs. Garrison better." "I think I will like it better too," he said. The spring and summer that followed were the kind of seasons that, in later years, Bessie would think of as the time they built everything. They plowed and planted on the homestead, and Isaac went 3 times a week to the South Fork to begin clearing the land his father had worked. And slowly the claim shack with the hole in the west wall came down, and the frame of a proper small house went up in its place. Bessie rode out with him most days, because she had opinions about where the house should face, and how the kitchen should be arranged, and Isaac had learned quickly that when Bessie Cooper had opinions, the conversation went better for everyone if she was present to voice them. They hired a man from town named Elias Dobbs to help with the framing, a quiet carpenter in his 40s who did excellent work and asked no questions about how the Garrisons had come to own both properties, which Isaac appreciated. The South Fork house was finished before the first frost, small but well built, with 2 rooms and a proper stone chimney and windows that faced east to catch the morning light. They did not move there. They talked about it and decided that the original cabin, with its established garden and its proximity to the creek and its 3 years of Bessie's careful improvements, was the better home, and the South Fork house would serve for ranch work, for shelter during long days on that end of the land. Isaac filed the papers to consolidate the 2 properties under a single claim, and Harold Prout processed it without incident, noting in the record that the forged 1876 transfer had been formally nullified. In September, Bessie realized she was going to have a baby. She told Isaac on a Sunday morning when they were sitting on the porch with coffee watching the aspens turn gold on the ridge above the creek, and she told him directly and without preamble because that was the way she had always told him important things. He put his coffee cup down very slowly. Then he looked at her. Then he looked back at the aspens. Then he looked at her again. "Bessie," he said. "Yes," she said. "We are going to have a baby," he said, as if saying it aloud was the way to make certain it was real. "That is what I just said," she said gently. He reached out and took her hand across the porch railing, the same easy natural gesture as the day the thaw began, and held it. "I want to tell you," he said, "that I am going to take care of both of you, that whatever I need to do, I will do it, that you will not face any of this the way you faced the last years. You will not be alone in this." "I know," she said, because she did know, with a certainty that was different from any certainty she had known before. She had known Isaac Garrison for nearly a year, and she knew that his word was the most reliable thing she had encountered in the Wyoming territory. "I know," she said again and squeezed his hand. He sat with her on the porch for the rest of the morning without going in to do any of the dozen things he had planned to do, just sitting there with her in the September gold, and she let him, because some mornings are worth sitting still for. The baby was born in April, just past the first anniversary of the day they had stood in front of Brother Caldwell and exchanged their promises. He was a boy, strong and loud from the first moment, with Bessie's dark hair and Isaac's eyes, and when Isaac held him for the first time his face did something that she had never seen it do before, something that had no name but was composed of every kind of love and terror and gratitude at once. They named him William for Isaac's father. Isaac had not asked Bessie. He had not needed to. When she held the baby the first time and he asked if she had any thoughts on names, she had said William before he had finished the question, and the look on his face had told her everything she needed to know about whether she had chosen right. Ruth Carver came to help for the first 2 weeks, and Brother Caldwell came through on his April circuit and performed the baptism with the same matter-of-fact warmth he had applied to the wedding. And William Isaac Garrison regarded the water on his forehead with an expression of profound indignation that made everyone in the room laugh. The years that followed were full ones. They were not without difficulty. There was a drought summer that took most of the garden and a sickness in the cattle the following spring that cost them 6 head. and a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Dorsey over the fence line on the north boundary that required 2 trips to town, and one very cold-tempered morning on horseback, with Bessie pointing out the surveyor's marks to a man who had chosen to misread them. But the difficulties were the ordinary difficulties of a working life, not the hidden debts and secret deceptions and building dread of the years before, and they faced each difficulty together in the way that 2 people face things when they trust each other completely. Isaac finished building a proper full-sized barn on the South Fork in the summer of William's 2nd year, and they brought the cattle herd there for the summer grazing season, which was exactly as productive as Isaac had predicted it would be based on years of watching that pasture go to waste. The cattle operation grew steadily, not dramatically but honestly, the way things grow when they are properly tended. Bessie started a small school in the valley in the spring of the year William turned 3. There were 7 children within riding distance whose parents wanted them to have learning and no schoolhouse to provide it, and she applied to the Territorial Education Office for a designation as a community school and received a small grant for materials. And every Tuesday and Thursday she taught in the cleared main room of the original cabin, and Isaac took the mornings to bring in wood and ensure the fire was going before the children arrived. Because his wife was running a school, and he was not going to let anyone's child sit cold while learning. The woman in the letters, Frank Cooper's previous wife, was named Margaret Hale, and Bessie found her through a series of careful letters to the Territorial Records Office in the spring after the wedding. Margaret Hale was living in Denver, had been living there since before Frank went to Wyoming, and had believed for years that Frank had abandoned her rather than died. She wrote back to Bessie's letter with a mixture of relief and grief that Bessie recognized deeply, and they corresponded for several years afterward, 2 women who had loved the same man badly and were making different lives on the other side of it. There was no bitterness between them. They had been wronged by the same person, and they extended to each other the dignity of acknowledgement. Elias Dobbs, the carpenter who had helped frame the South Fork house, married Ruth Carver in the winter of William's 1st year, which surprised nobody who had paid attention to the frequency with which Ruth had found reasons to bring things to the South Fork building site during its construction. Isaac and Bessie stood as witnesses at that wedding, and all 4 of them celebrated at the Garrison cabin afterward with Ruth's cooking and Isaac's carefully saved whiskey, and the general warmth of people who have found, against the odds of a hard land, the particular grace of community. William grew into a serious, curious boy with his mother's practicality and his father's steadiness, and when he was 4, a sister arrived, born in summer, named Clara Ruth in honor of her mother's friend. Clara was nothing like William. She arrived loud and remained loud, with an opinion about everything from the temperature of her porridge to the proper order of the evening routine, and Bessie looked at her small, fierce daughter and recognized something she had always wanted and never known to ask for. Isaac was a father with the same quality he was everything else present, consistent, patient with the things that required patience, and clear about the things that required clarity. He built William a wooden horse that Christmas of the year he turned 5, painstakingly carved over weeks of evenings, while Bessie pretended not to notice the wood shavings on the storage room floor. He taught Clara to ride before she was 3, which was perhaps earlier than strictly necessary, but she had demanded it with such absolute conviction that neither parent had found a convincing argument against it. The South Fork became, over the years, a place of particular meaning for the Garrisons. They went there often as a family, for the summer cattle work and sometimes simply to go, and the house Isaac had built there with the east-facing windows was used for summer evenings when the light was long and the valley below was purple with sage. There was a place on the South Fork, on a small rise above the creek, where Isaac had at last gotten a headstone put in for his father's grave, paid for with the first real profits from the cattle herd. It was a plain stone with the name and dates and the words, "He knew this land was worth keeping." Isaac stood at that grave with his hat in his hands and his wife beside him and his son on the ground at his feet, examining a beetle in the grass. And whatever he said to his father in the privacy of his own heart, Bessie did not intrude on it, only stood close enough that he could feel her there. They had been married 5 years when Isaac told her, one evening in the kitchen while she was making supper, and he was supposed to be reading, but was instead watching her with the particular look she had come to know as the one that preceded an important statement, that she was the best thing that had happened in his life, and he wanted her to know that he knew it. She turned from the stove and looked at him. "You are only saying that because I am making your favorite supper," she said. "I am saying it because it is true," he said, "and also because the supper smells very good. Both things can be true." She laughed, which she did often now in ways she had not before, and said, "You are the best thing that happened to me too, even though I pointed a rifle at you." "Especially because you pointed a rifle at me," Isaac said. "It was how I knew you were worth knowing." She shook her head and turned back to the stove, smiling at the wall, and felt him cross the kitchen and come to stand behind her, his hands on her shoulders, his chin on the top of her head for a moment. The two of them in the warm kitchen with the supper on the stove, and the children playing noisily in the next room, and the Wyoming evening coming down gold and wide outside the window. The small school Bessie ran out of the cabin, eventually outgrew the main room. By the time William was ready to start his own schooling, she had 9 children enrolled and had applied twice more to the Territorial Education Office, and had been awarded enough funds to build a small, dedicated schoolhouse at the edge of the property, simple and tight against the winter, with 4 windows and a stove and a proper chalkboard ordered from a catalog. Isaac and Elias built it in the fall, and when it was finished, it was as good a schoolhouse as you could find in that part of the territory, and Bessie stood in the doorway on the first morning it opened and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing done well. Harold Prout retired from the land office in 1890 and was replaced by a man who was somewhat less scrupulous, and Isaac found himself spending 2 full days in Laramie, ensuring that the consolidated Garrison claim records were properly updated and unambiguous. And when he came home from the second trip, he was tired and irritated, and Bessie made him coffee and let him talk about it until the irritation was out of his system, which took approximately 45 minutes and 2 cups, and then she said, "It is handled now, yes." And he said, "It is handled," and she said, "Good. Then sit down and eat something and stop looking like you lost a war when you clearly won it." And he laughed despite himself, which was what she had been aiming for. William, at 7, developed a passion for horses that exceeded even his mother's considerable regard for the mare that had started the whole story. He spent every available hour in the stable, and Isaac began teaching him the proper way to handle and care for a horse with a seriousness that William received with equal seriousness. The two of them side by side in the stable with the same expression on their faces while they worked, which was a thing Bessie found so affecting that she drew them from the doorway one afternoon with a bit of charcoal on paper, a talent she had not used since Pennsylvania and had not thought of since. And the drawing was not elegant, but it was true, and she kept it. Clara, at 2, and then 3, and then 4, was a creature of pure determined will who had decided the world was primarily composed of things she had not yet gotten to touch, and Bessie recognized the feeling. She was teaching Clara her letters by 4 in the same schoolroom where she taught the Valley's other children, and Clara was learning them with the same absolute conviction she applied to everything, demanding to know what each one said and why, and Bessie thought, watching her daughter's fierce, concentrated face, that she would either be a schoolteacher or a lawyer, and either way the world had better be paying attention. A third child came in the winter of 1891, the year Bessie turned 31. A girl again, which Clara received with mixed feelings. She had wanted a brother and said so at volume, named Francis, called Frankie almost immediately because the name suited her, a compact, determined child who looked entirely like Isaac, and had the easy temperament that sometimes appears in families as if to balance out the more energetic members. Isaac, at 36, was the kind of man that the passing years had built rather than worn down. The work had made him stronger, and the sun had made him browned, and the years of the life he had built had made him sure of himself in the way of someone who has had good reasons to be sure. He was known in the valley as a fair man, someone whose word meant what it said, and whose handshake was as binding as a document. And when he spoke at the occasional town meetings in Laramie, which he did not enjoy and Bessie had to nudge him into, what he said was listened to because it was always measured and always true. Bessie, at 31, was the school teacher of the valley and the practical intelligence of the Garrison operation, and the woman who had turned an enemy into a husband by the simple mechanism of refusing to let an injustice stand, and who had learned, one hard truth at a time, that the love worth having is the love built on knowing someone completely and choosing them anyway. On the morning of their 7th wedding anniversary, she woke early, before Isaac, which was unusual because he was habitually the earlier riser. She lay for a moment listening to the sound of him breathing and the sound of the creek outside the window, running free the way it always ran in spring, and she thought about that first day, the rifle and the stolen horse and the blizzard coming down, and how far those two furious strangers standing at a frozen creek had traveled to arrive here in this warm cabin with 3 children sleeping in the next room, and a cattle herd on the South Fork pasture, and a schoolhouse at the edge of the property, and a ring on her finger that meant what it said. She thought about how the distance was not measured in miles but in trust, and how trust was built not from grand gestures but from small ones, accumulated over months and seasons, from coffee made before the other person was awake, from loose horseshoes noticed and stables rechinked, from the careful handling of a man's grief and a woman's loneliness, and the space where both might breathe. She thought about how Isaac Garrison had never once in 7 years given her reason to doubt him, had never hidden a thing from her, had never promised more than he could give, had always been standing exactly where he said he would be. And she thought about how that specific, ordinary constancy was the most extraordinary thing she had ever been given, more extraordinary than the sweeping romance of her younger imaginings, more extraordinary than anything she had known how to want before she had known what wanting something real felt like. Isaac woke, the way he always woke, completely and at once, and turned his head and looked at her. "Good morning," he said in his early morning voice, rougher and quieter than the daytime one, and in 7 years it had not ceased to feel like something she was glad to hear. "Good morning," she said. "Happy anniversary." "Happy anniversary," he said, and reached over and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face, gently, the way you do a thing when you have done it many times and it has not gotten old. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he agreed. "You remember what we were doing 7 years ago today," she said. "Standing in front of Brother Caldwell trying not to look nervous," Isaac said. "You were not nervous, I was nervous. You did not look nervous." "That is the only thing I was certain of," he said. "Not looking nervous." She laughed, and he smiled, and outside the April morning was beginning. The creek and the birds and the particular quality of spring light that comes early in Wyoming and fills the whole eastern sky before it reaches the ground. Through the wall they heard Clara's voice, which was generally the first thing heard in the morning regardless of the hour, informing William of something with absolute certainty, and William's patient response, and then Frankie's smaller voice joining the conversation with a contribution that nobody could quite make out but that seemed to satisfy her. "Our children," Isaac said, with an expression that was entirely content. "Our children," Bessie said. He pulled her close and she put her head against his chest and listened to his heart, steady and present the way it had always been. And the morning came in through the window, and the creek ran over the stones, and somewhere outside, a meadowlark started up with the extravagant optimism of a bird that has survived a Wyoming winter and considers this worth mentioning. They had made something here, the two of them, out of a blizzard and a stolen horse and a forged land deed, and the stubborn refusal of two people to let injustice stand unchallenged. They had made a homestead and a cattle operation and a schoolhouse and 3 children with their eyes and their stubbornness and their capacity for love. They had made a marriage that was made of real things, built from a winter's worth of truth-telling and the first thaw and everything that had come after. The land was right. The life was right. The man in her arms was exactly the man he had always been, exactly the man she had chosen, exactly the man she would choose again from the beginning if the beginning were offered to her, even with the rifle and the blizzard and the frozen creek, even with everything that had come before, especially with all of that. Because that was where it had started, on the hard, cold edge of the worst winter she had known, and she would not have traded any of it for anything easier, because the easy things did not build what this had built, and what this had built was enough, and more than enough, and everything. The meadowlark kept singing outside, and Isaac held her, and the children made their morning noise in the next room, and the April light came all the way in at last, and Bessie Cooper Garrison closed her eyes and let it be, exactly as it was, exactly as they had made it, and it was very good.